Hey, how's it going, everyone? This is Spencer Campbell, and I've been talking on Twitter about doing like design commentary about some of my games. I released a few games this year. This is my first time really publishing games. Been listening to a lot of design commentary, and it seems kind of interesting. So I thought it'd be fun or interesting at least to try and go through some of my games, see what I was thinking at the time, see if I can even reflect on some of that stuff. And I thought I'd kind of go chronologically. So let's start at the beginning of the year where I released my first game, which was Score. Score actually was not called Score for the longest time. It was called Heists and Dice, a truly atrocious name, but it was a placeholder name that I and my friend Mike had used for a long time whenever we talked about Score. And it honestly had just been sitting in a Google Drive folder for a long time until I heard about Zine Quest. And that was sort of the kind of the kick, the push to, all right, let's just make something. And so Score came about as a result of that. And I had no layout skills. I knew how to kind of write rules. At least I thought I knew how to write rules. My friend Mike knew how to do layout stuff, and he wanted to design a game, so he needed help with rules. And so we kind of did a I scratch your back, you scratch my back sort of thing. And we ended up each making a Zine Quest project. So Score was mine. And the logo here comes from Jake Riemann, who is Mike Riemann, the graphic designer for this zine's brother. He did the logo, and then he did the character art that you see later in the book. But the first art you actually see here is art created by a friend of Mike and I's named Kaylee. She's a fantastic artist, and this is actually my first piece of commissioned art ever in my whole life. At the time when I was asking for it, I didn't really know what Score was going to look like, had no sense of what the artistic direction of the zine was. I just described to her that it's going to be two people. You're not really sure who they are or what they're all about. They're wearing suits, and they're criminals that wear masks. And, I didn't really give her too much more beyond that. And she kind of had some fun with it, as you can see, with the mask that she chose. She went with a paper bag and a unicorn mask. And I think it's fantastic. It's definitely different than the art that you see later on in the book, but this piece just has a special place in my heart because it's the first piece that I ever commissioned. So going through here, you can tell that this is my old one because it's got my old itch address. It's got Wizbot Games, which is a gaming collective that Mike and I started a while ago. And then nothing like my Twitter presence or anything like that. It has written by me. There's Kaylee again as the cover art, character art, Jake Riemann, who also did the logo, and then Mike Riemann, who that name might be familiar to you. Mike is doing the layout for Dust. So if you've seen a lot of the art for Dust and things like that, he's responsible. I think it's cool to leave inspirations. I don't always do this with games, but this was my first one, so I really wanted to kind of lay it out there. The biggest, most obvious inspiration for this game is the video game Payday. I played hundreds of hours of Payday with friends years ago, and so I've always wanted to make Payday the role-playing game, and so that's obviously where this comes from. But you can see that there are some other inspirations that are worth taking a look at. So here's the name of the game, and then there's this. So it says by Dr. Spencer Campbell, PhD. I didn't write that. I want to make sure that that's clear. I didn't write Dr. Spencer Campbell. My friend Mike, who did the layout for this, is very proud that I got my PhD in psychology, and so this is a demonstration of his love, I think, by putting this in as my signature on the title page. I don't think I actually even noticed it until like files were sent away for the printer and everything. So this is just something that's out there now. I don't put Dr. Spencer Campbell, PhD on any of my other stuff, but it's just something that's out there in the world. So table of contents, and right away you can kind of see that the layout style that Mike goes for is generally like relatively clean, which I think is really nice. He's got the background going on here, but Mike's background's like a lot of his stuff, graphic design outside of games, is this really like neat and clean looking stuff. And I think that shows in a lot of parts of the book. And so what is Score exactly? It's a role-playing game that's about pulling off big heists and doing crime, essentially. And that kind of became a theme for me for this year, is making a lot of games that were about doing crime. And basically it has what I call an original or unique mechanic, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But the whole point of this game when I first created it was that it was going to be this light, punchy, quick game. And I think it still accomplishes that, but that had always kind of been the goal. It does follow that sort of traditional that traditional setup that you see with like GM and PCs. Again, that's mostly just because at the time, that's all I knew. It's still, I think, probably it's the format that I prefer. I just prefer that sort of directed format as opposed to going GM-less. But that's just my personal play style. One thing that I like to put in my games is this concept of the cycle of play, and I think this is really important because I saw that get highlighted in Blades in the Dark. The reason I like Blades so much is it has this unbelievably crisp cycle of play where you know you're going to go do a thing, usually like a job of some kind, and then you come back and you do the downtime, and they feed into each other. It's this perfect loop. And so I like thinking about games in terms of what does a cycle of play look like? Not necessarily what a session looks like, but what is the flow of the game supposed to be? And the idea here is that you're going to go do a job, you're going to reflect on that job, and then you're going to do another job, and you're going to keep doing that until you decide you're done playing score. So how does this game work? I'm not going to go into like deep into the mechanics here because this is more just like director commentary or designer commentary. But score is a dueling pool, like dice pool system that I went and got the book off the shelf. Is heavily inspired by the end of the world games by Fantasy Flight, which I don't think are in print anymore. So I'm really glad that I have a copy of one of the books. They're really cool apocalypse games where you play yourself. And actually, it's one of my favorite games to use when showing people role-playing games because they don't have to pretend to be somebody else. They're themselves. That helps ease you into role-playing, I think, the concept of it. But one of the things about End of the World is that you had these positive and negative traits about yourself, and they created these dice pools, and then you rolled the dice, and it used sort of a net system to see if you succeeded on things, and then consequences based off of negative dice that still remained. You see that in score, where score is this idea of basically you got good dice and bad dice, and you're rolling against a target number, a target value that the GM is going to call for. And you want to get at least one good dice, or what are called cool dice, at or above that. And then any heat dice that are below that are going to be problematic. So now you're kind of doing two comparisons whenever you roll the dice. You're looking for your good dice to be big, and you're looking for, well, you also want your heat dice, your bad dice to be big, because if they're small, you're in trouble. The other thing that I added to the game and was prep, which is sort of this pool of dice that the table can use at any point in time to just add dice to their pool to increase the odds that they succeed. This was largely because the game was originally intended to be a one-shot. And so you didn't have the capacity to get more good dice. You just had what you started with. And so you were supposed to dwindle away this resource over time. It still remains. That's still the purpose of it. But that's why it was created in the first place, is because score was originally supposed to be a single session, one shot sort of game. So like I said, you're rolling dice, pools of dice, and you'll note that the difficulty value that the GM picks is between 2 and 6. Because if they choose 1, the person never fails. So 2 is like wildly easy, 6 is impossibly difficult. Still technically possible, but just very, very hard, which means that most rolls in the game end up at 3 or 4 as the difficulty value. And that's just sort of how, like in Blades in the Dark, going back to that, the standard roll is risky standard. There's, in a lot of games, pick your poison, there's a sort of average difficulty, average threshold. So given such the limited range that this is supposed to have here, 2 to 6, obviously the average is going to be something like 3 or 4. So people are rolling these dice, and as long as you get one of your cool dice, those good dice, at or above, you do the thing, regardless of how complex it is. As long as you get one die above, you're good to go. You then look to see about consequences, and that's all the heat dice that are lower than that. And you have to decide what you do. And this is what I think. This is one of the things that I really like about the game. This is actually early on in discussions I talked about. One of the things I like about score so much is that failure is like an interesting choice for players. And I remember I talked about this on Reddit a long time ago, and immediately people are like, "Oh, well, failure shouldn't be the thing that you're advertising. Nobody wants to fail." And I fundamentally disagree with that concept. I think failing interestingly is interesting. Like, I think we can make failure an interesting thing, a part of the conversation that people seek. I think that's why I like Spire and Resistance games so much, is because failure is something almost people seek. Fallout that you get in those games is fun. It changes the game fundamentally in cool ways. And so I'm an advocate of failure being kind of a thing that you should seek in your games rather than just always succeeding. And so in Score, the way I represented that is you can choose two options when you have these bad dice remaining on the table. You can either take on the responsibility yourself. You can say, my bad, I messed up. And when you do that, you add one more of those heat dice, those bad dice, to your pool. Meaning from now on, for the rest of the heist, you're more likely to have future complications, because all those heat dice, not only do they trigger these complications here, but they also create opportunities for the GM to introduce twists and turns and bad things. So you're now making things harder for yourself personally if you choose that. Or you can choose to sort of spread out the responsibility across the whole crew by increasing what's called the threat meter, which is explained a little bit later. But it's basically this big clock going on in the background. And if that clock ever fills, game over. Like, literally, the heist is over. You lose. The crew is arrested or killed or whatever. And so there's no immediate horrible thing that happens to you personally oftentimes when you fill in the threat meter, but you are now putting everybody else at risk. And so you get to sort of choose, do you want to own up to it, or do you want everybody else to kind of have to deal with the consequence at a lower threshold? I think that's interesting. There's an example of play, which actually is a thing that I don't do enough in my games, I think. Because most of my games are shorter, and so I just don't have room for it or don't think to do it, or they're just straightforward enough. So like I said, the threat meter is this thing, this clock. And the threat meter is also a choice that the GM makes at the beginning, is they choose how big it is. Because, again, when that thing gets filled up, game over. So if your threat meter is only a 4-segment clock, that implies that the game is going to end very quickly if the players keep messing up. They're either going to have to just keep on taking the problems onto themselves, or the game's going to end real quick when the threat meter fills up. Now, I talk about it, and it's up to the GM to decide if they want to show off the threat meter, if they want to hide it. That's, I think, honestly, just a personal preference for GMs. I'm not going to tell you which way to play the game, but it's, if you got that 4-segment clock and you're hiding that away, I think some players might feel bamboozled if suddenly you're 30 minutes into the session and then you're just like, sorry, you lose. Cops are here. So play with it however you want. But bigger threat meters imply more wiggle room for the players to play around with, which I think is really, it's helpful, especially, again, given that the game was originally designed as a one-shot. You want people to have fun during that one shot. You don't want it to end in 20 minutes. The classes are called criminals, and they are, you better believe, 100% inspired by Payday 2. I mean, I just took the classes from Payday 2. I changed their names a little bit, and then I just took largely what their roles were in that video game and turned them into characters. And criminals in this game are very light. There's not a lot going on in terms of mechanics generally in Score. And so as a result, the character classes are also pretty minimal. Basically, you're going to have stats, and you really only have 3 numbers: your good dice, your bad dice, and your prep dice, cool, heat, and prep. Gear, which isn't even mechanically a thing. It's just recommended things you might have. And then the rest of it is all honestly about advancement. So you've got these goals that you want to accomplish to become a better criminal, or to at least make things easier for yourself between jobs. You want to advance your character, and then eventually you're done. You got one final advance. So a character class is 3 numbers and then some pieces of suggested inventory that have no mechanical effect at all, actually. So what I tell people to do is to look over these classes, think about which one sounds like the most interesting to you, and then go with that. These goals that characters have, these are goals that whenever that class does that thing during the heist, it is either going to permanently increase their cool dice, which are the good one, or at the end of a heist, it's going to remove heat that you've accumulated. Because remember, your bad dice pool is going to get bigger and bigger. So you had to have some way of relieving yourself of that heat. And this is where it kind of got not weird, but different for me when I first started creating this game. It was not supposed to have advancement. It was a one-shot game, and it was a stretch goal, actually, of the Zine Quest to add advancement rules. And I think there are pros and cons to playing the game with sort of these advancement rules or the one-shot. I honestly still prefer playing it in the one-shot version, but I know there are folks out there who like to see their characters grow. And so I created these rules for advancement that borrow from the ideas that we see in a lot of games that are about learning from your mistakes. So you know how in most Powered by the Apocalypse games, if you roll a 6 or less on a roll, you mark XP. The idea behind that is that your character is learning from their mistakes. They messed up so bad that now they suddenly they learn a valuable lesson in that fuck up. And so same thing going on here, but since we're not tracking like yeses and nos on dice, like dice ranges like that, you have all this heat at the end of the heist, and you're actually going to spend that to buy the other advances that you have. So you mess up a bunch during the heist, you get a bunch of heat thrown at you, and then after the heist, you reflect on that. That was kind of what the idea of this advancement system is that your criminal reflects on it, goes, wow, I really hope that doesn't happen again. Let me spend some of this heat to buy advances. And ideally, you're able to spend all the heat to get rid of, whatever heat you have and take some cool advances. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you accumulate like a wild amount of heat and you can buy in advance, but then you're still going into the next job with a lot of heat. And so it's going to change the way that you play the next job, where maybe you might want to be a little bit chiller about things just because your character's still recovering from the really like the horrible time they had during the last job. It all leads up to one last job. I don't honestly remember how many advances everybody has. Not that many. The whole point of it is like you play 5 or 6 sessions with your criminal and then you're done. It's not supposed to be a game that you play for years. And so you get one cool job or one cool advance at the end, and you're supposed to work with the GM and make sure that you get to highlight that last advance because it's usually something exciting. So here are the criminals themselves. The face is as the sort of descriptor says, it's the brains of the operation or the mouthpiece, right? This is the person who's going to talk their way out of everything. And everybody's starting here at 1 cool and 1 heat. The face has the most prep that they bring to the table. So if you don't have a face in your group, you don't have a bunch of prep dice that goes into that communal pool. So you're really working with just whatever stats you have and a small amount of prep. So bringing a face gives you all a lot of flexibility, which is kind of what the goal was. The goals for the face then are to talk their way into places and then also use that talking to shift blame from themselves. I liked the advances that when I was designing advances for these classes, some of them had like obvious, just like straight up better things. Like, for example, like the top advance is ready. You can take more than 1 prep die when you roll. And that the rule is normally that you can only take 1 prep die. So this gives the face the ability to show off that they are always prepared. They're going to put together a huge pool of dice if they've got this, big action that they're trying to pull off. It's really, really important. They can do that. And then similarly, their last advanced team player, normally when you accomplish your cool goal, you get more cool dice. So you're going to be better in future jobs. You could, as the face, instead add permanently to your prep pool, which says, I myself am not going to be as effective. My character is not going to become a more effective criminal with time, but I am adding to the prep, which means I want our team to be more effective. So in many ways, the face kind of plays this role of a support character. And then their one last job thing, when it's time for that one last job, what was that? Well, they get to just add a bunch more prep back to the stash, which is super, super helpful. Spectre then is the ghost, right? They're the spec ops person. They're the sneaky person. They're going in and they are, as you can see from the gear that they have, they've got like a jammer, a silence pistol, and lockpicks. Again, there's no mechanical effect for any of these things. I talk about gear being this thing that is, it might allow you in the fiction to describe why you're able to do something in the first place, but none of these things actually, like, there's no stats, right, for a pistol. There's no stats for killing people. There's no stats for lockpicks or anything like that. It's just something that you have as a Spectre, which means you're the one that's probably going to be picking locks. So they're also doing these things like sneaking in or evading. Most of all these classes I kind of borrowed from the idea of Blades, where the top advance is sort of the straightforward, like the one that's probably the best or the obvious choice if it's your first time playing. So for the Spectre, it's as long as that threat meter, that global clock thing, has 2 or fewer segments filled in, you always just roll more effectively. Meaning, as long as the crew hasn't really been noticed, you're better off. You like it when things are quiet. And then that's sort of also represented with the last advance, silent but deadly, which is your difficulty value for killing anybody is just however many segments are filled in plus 2, which means early on, your difficulty is just 2 to kill people. You are highly effective at just wiping people out early on when nobody knows that you're there. As the heist goes on and that segment fills in, it's harder and harder for the ghost to be an effective killer. They're now really struggling to do any kind of violence, and they're really just desperately trying to get the heist over with because they don't do well in those situations. Houdini is one of those advances that's just one of those once per session, some ridiculously powerful thing happens. So you can just say where you want to be and you're just there. I think I like advances like that. Again, that's why I like games like Spire, because you just get powers that are just really powerful, and just because it's more fun that way. The tech is one of those characters that brings a little bit more prep. They have 3 compared to the Spectre, which only brings 2. This is the tech person, right? So they're bringing in gear. They got the drills. They got a hacking tablet. Maybe they got drones of some kind. It's up to you all to decide what kind of tech the tech has on them. But they are all about, they're the person that might be sitting in the van the whole time. If you roll up in your van to rob this jewelry store, the tech might never leave the van. They might use their eyes through the surveillance system to coordinate efforts. They're the voice in your ear as the Spectre is moving through the hallway. They don't even have to leave the van to be effective. And I think that's kind of cool to have that sort of character. And every time somebody plays a tech, they are always very creative with what they try to get away with their tech stuff. I think it's probably the most creative class. The face is going to be your typical, whoever likes to talk the most picks the face. People who like to do sneaky stuff, obviously, with the Spectre. The last class is for the person who wants to be the badass, who hurts people. The tech is, I honestly think, the creative class. And there's some cool ways of playing around with that. One of the things is that the prep is, or that this person is supposed to take on challenging things, right? They're supposed to be like drilling through vault doors. They're supposed to be overriding security systems, which means this character also has an opportunity to add back to the prep whenever they do difficult things. They're encouraged to take on hard tasks because it's probably big. They're probably big impact tasks, like shutting down all the security cameras in a facility. And in doing so, that adds to the prep pool, which is very helpful. And then they also eventually get that idea of once per heist, they roll all their dice, good and bad, and they only think about they just treat them all as successes. The bad dice, they don't get factored into negative stuff. This is just I've got to brute force my way through the system. It has to happen. I think that's kind of cool. And then they also have the ability to cool things down. That's their one last job thing, is to just, when the threat meter gets filled in, what if it's that last segment? It's the game over segment. The tech can be like, wait a minute, I've got something, and then they throw out some wild explanation for why that segment doesn't get filled in, but then it happens, and it's again, I think it's the most creative class. It's very fun to listen to. Hammer was the class that was probably the hardest to think about, because the game is not a combat game, but inevitably some of the heists that I came up with and thought about is that the shit's gonna hit the fan eventually. And when that happens, do you want the players just rolling a bunch of like escape dice, or do you want somebody to step forward and save them all when that happens? And that's sort of the role that the Hammer is they get in and they mess shit up when things are bad. So they come in, and this is the one class that starts with or this is a class that has more cool to start with, because they have basically no prep. So this person starts off actually more effective than some of the other classes. And that's just because they serve a very specific purpose. As you can see from their gear, they have a bunch of guns, they've got a bulletproof vest, a small set of explosives, and they're going to use it when they need to. And I think the thing that best represents the Hammer is the first advance, which is basically when the threat meter, this says heat meter, so you can see this is an older file. When the threat meter has 2 or fewer segments filled in, everything is harder for you. Meaning when the job is quiet, the Hammer is not effective. They don't like a quiet heist. But the second 3 or more segments get filled in, everything is easier for the Hammer. They thrive in the chaos. And I think that's a super fun way of playing, the balance between like a Spectre and a Hammer. Spectre is highly effective early on in the heist. Inevitably, things are going to go wrong. And then the Hammer comes in and finishes the job for everybody, or drags the Spectre back into the van, as all the bullets are flying, and saves their ass. That's sort of the balance that I was looking for between these two characters. And again, this was a hard character to design, especially because of like the violence stuff, because there's no rules for combat. So, I alluded to how violence or killing could be done with this class without being overt in the mechanics for it. And that's really it, right? Like that's the classes. There's just those 4. They're very light. As you can see, remember, they're just a couple of numbers and some advances. And then I wrote a GM section. And I think what I'm learning from writing more games is how to write GM sections, I guess, slimmer or more focused. Because right now, like, this has just sort of the generic GM advice that you see in a lot of games, like ask questions. And I'm assuming that anybody that reads Score has probably read a role-playing game before they read Score. I know that's not universally true, but it's 99% of the time true. And so I don't think I need to be the one to advise you on asking questions as a GM, but I think it's also just important to reiterate that from time to time. This is the big thing, though, for me, is that this is a game about failure and consequences and choosing what to do in those consequences, which means you as the GM need to create interesting consequences for the players. I write it out here that players are going to have plans. They always do if it's a crime game, but you don't want them to use any of those plans, or you want them to use most of those plans, and then suddenly that plan is insufficient and they need a new plan and they need to make it up on the spot. I don't like games that are heavy prep intense, so you're just sitting there planning for sessions. Like, that's a Shadowrun sort of thing. And I also, Blades is very fun, but in Blades, you don't always plan. In fact, you're not really encouraged to plan things. And I like some planning. And so Score is supposed to sit somewhere kind of comfortably between those two things. So I give some recommendations for GMs about what to do. These complications, these consequences should look familiar to anybody that's ever read Blades or any Powered by the Apocalypse games. They are the same sort of consequences that you see anytime somebody gets one of those success with a complication or success with a consequence rolls, that 7 to 9 or the 4 and 5 in Blades, right? Where yes, the thing happens, but also it's not as effective, or here's this twist, now this is part of the scene, or you only got it halfway done and you need to keep working at it. I give the same sort of advice here. And then I also give advice on what to do with the threat meter, because yes, it's a clock that once it fills up, the game is over. But if it's just a clock that just fills, there's nothing interesting about it as it's filling. And so I recommend GMs, not at every segment, but for many segments or like half the segments, do something. Have some huge major consequence, because that's what the threat meter is supposed to represent, is major consequences, major heat on everybody in the job. So trip that alarm, make everything harder for like the next roll for everybody, or give everybody one more heat die, or just take away some of their prep. That will show them their consequences to their actions. Here's what I say about combat. Don't think about it too much. And I think that's just kind of my MO. You see that in Corvid Court too, where it's just like, if you want to hurt somebody and you roll well, they're hurt. We don't need to track hit points or anything like that in this sort of game. This game has no stats like that. So it really is just, if they want to hurt somebody and they've set it up, then they can do it. But these are also criminals who probably don't want a bunch of attention, or if they're getting shot at, they're in a really bad situation. Once the criminals start getting shot at, the heist is probably almost over, because they'll be overwhelmed. There's 4 of them max, right? Versus however many security guards or cops or whatever are at the location. So I emphasize that it's not important, or not encouraged to get into these long drawn out fights. Also, equipment is total BS, right? I recommend starting equipment. It's not prescriptive in any way. You can do with it what you will. And I think every time I've played, characters have always asked me, can I have this instead? And I don't think anybody has ever asked for anything so wild that it didn't make sense. And even if they did, I oftentimes don't say no. And I think that's pretty typical for people who are going to play score, because most people are going to play score as a one-off sort of thing. So then I needed to give you resources. That's the game, right? That's all you need technically to play the game is everything that I said. In fact, you didn't even need the GM section. Those are the rules in, like, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 something pages. It's not many. So then I wanted to give resources to folks. So like, what are you actually going to do? What does a heist mean? And so I created a generator, like a bunch of tables that you could use to create your own heists or to create ideas of heists. And so there are a bunch of tables here for the genre of heist, the security at that place, any kind of additional details, and you can roll on as many of these columns as you would like. And these are going to show off. This is basically determining a lot of difficulty for the heist. Is it going to be in a public space or a private space? How many civilians are around? Is this just a bunch of floors, or is it a single story sort of place? But what I think is really cool about score are these sections, which is all right, so you rolled up a jewelry store, or you want to do a jewelry store robbery. Well, what is that like? What does it mean to rob a jewelry store? And so I write a short description, but then in all of these heists, I give, here are some consequences or threat meter segment things you can do that are specific to this type of heist, because the things that are in the GM section are they're generic. So this is something that is now very specific to a jewelry store. So, for example, a consequence, like the first threat meter segment gets filled in, and now somebody walks into the jewelry store and wants to buy or try on or see the thing that you were sent here to steal. Maybe there's some big ass diamond that you were supposed to steal, and this person has just suddenly showed up and they're interested in buying it. Well, great. It helps that maybe the diamond is going to be out of the case, but now you've got eyes on the piece. So what are you going to do about that? And I think this is the stuff that's especially helpful I think this stuff is way more helpful to the GM than anything I wrote in the GM section. Is like, here are some very specific examples about what you can do. And then I also give some tables that you can roll on to figure out more details about the place, or what I call varieties and sub goals. These are things that you can use to add some complications. Or let's say you already ran a jewelry store, but you rolled it and you got a jewelry store again. Do you re-roll and do a different heist, or could you try a totally different variation on a jewelry store? So one time you might smash and grab. It's literally about just breaking the cases and taking everything you want. Another one is about replacing a very specific piece. And so when you do that, that's going to be a very different approach. The criminals are going to have to do things differently. Sub goals are there then to, again, sort of just allow replayability of these heists, so that you could, as a GM, prep like a jewelry store that anytime you want to run it with a group, you have this one jewelry store you can use, and you can always just use new varieties or sub goals with it to play it again. So I did this with a bunch of these. So like there's a house robbery. This is probably the lowest stakes heist of all the heists. It's, like a guard dog is there. But then I also allude to some weird stuff, like the homeowners have a dark secret, so who knows what's going on. And then obviously, what kind of house is it? There's, I try. Can you make a house robbery as interesting as possible? So there's a lot of robbery stuff, but then there are other things. So the frame job is sort of a catch-all for just it's any job that runs sort of interference, or it's intelligence gathering. So like here are some examples, like rigging an election, or shifting blame on other people, blackmailing people, or sending a message of some kind. That's what a frame job is. Bank robbery, that's the classic heist. So what are you going to do with a bank robbery? I think I run bank robbery every time I run this game with folks for the first time. Although I don't do like a big bank, I do like a small town bank that doesn't have a whole lot of stuff going on, so that you still feel cool robbing a bank, but it's not like some multi-story, unbelievably difficult bank to rob. And I think that's a good way of helping people out. So then, the rest of this is just more of these heists, these different types of things, extraction, assassination. And so if you've got a table where you've got a hammer is one of your players. Let's say you just have two players. You have a hammer and a tech. Well, then they probably want to do things like assassinations more so than bank robberies, or, think about which criminals have been chosen, and choose the heists that are fitting to those criminals. You're not beholden to rolling on these tables to decide what you're going to do. I think this is helpful. These are helpful tools to show you as a GM, listen, there's a bunch of different ways you can do crime. Crime isn't just robbery. Crime is a lot of different things. Look to your players, see what they want to do, see what their goals are, quite literally on their characters. And then here at the end of the book is the one-shot variation, which is actually like the original rule. So this is how the characters were originally written. So they had no goals, no advances, or anything like that. They all had different starting cool and prep and everything, and then they just had set skills. So it was just, they were essentially advances, right? They were just some of the things that I turned into advances. So the face right away starts with 2 cool and 4 prep, and they do things like taking more prep right away. That's that golden ability that the face has. They just have that immediately. Spectre starts with 3 cool dice because you're only playing the one shot, so you might as well make yourself really effective at it. And again, you're seeing some of the skills being what were ultimately turned into the advances for these characters. And so yeah, you see that with the tech, you see that with the hammer, and that's pretty much score. Then you've got the special thanks section. This lists everybody that backed score as my first Kickstarter. And then that pretty much wraps up the game. And then there's all this beautiful art, all this character art that Jake Riemann did. I'm so happy with it. I think it's super cool, and everything is very exaggerated. And I think that's a big part of the crime genre, at least the way that I like crime genre, is that it's exaggerated. It shouldn't. I don't like hyper realistic. I like bombastic and you're flying by the seat of your pants sort of stuff. And that's what Score was supposed to be. It's supposed to be a game that's about, you're just making this shit up as you go, because you can prep all day long. Something inevitably is going to break. And so what are you going to do when that happens? So that's Score. That's the sort of my mentality of it. It was my first game that at first, got actually made into a physical object, which was very cool. And I had a ton of fun designing it. I had a ton of fun getting it out into the world. And I still want to do stuff with Score. I have ideas about doing a sort of Neo Score, a sort of cyberpunk version of it, that I don't want to just repaint Score with it, with vaporwave aesthetics and just call it Neo Score. There's some things that I want to do different. There's some lesson. There's lots of lessons that I learned from Score in terms of like basic things like running a Kickstarter and designing and all that sort of stuff. And so that's my commentary on Score, just scrolling through it. That'll be the end of this first one. I'll be doing more of these. I'm just going to go through the games that I made throughout this year, the more substantial ones, not just the single page things. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or you want to talk about Score, just let me know. Throw a comment down below or ask me on Gila RPGs on Twitter. And I'll talk to you all later.